Yeah,
No.
gentlemen, before we went on the break, we obviously were just examining the economic environment, and there are lots of interesting loopholes that need to be filled. Now, recently, the Senate Committee on Foreign and Local Debt expressed worry over the rising debt profile of the country and described the trend as a dangerous one to the nation's economy. And I'm wondering if it took this long for us to realize that, this is dangerous and we might be moving to some deep pit. And I said something to you earlier on while we were on the break. Christine Lagarde had expressed, the IMF boss, by the way, had expressed some displeasure at the rate at which we were dealing with our debt profile. In fact, there was a list of countries that were doing better with monies that they were given compared to Nigeria, which are the likes of Ethiopia, Rwanda, who are topping the charts, and the economies have been, rejigged, sort of. But for Nigeria, it just keeps having an all-time low. What is responsible for this?
Well, I think the key challenge is we don't have an appropriate regulatory framework that is guiding our borrowing. And I can tell you some examples of what we could have done at the national level. At the sub-national level, for states to go and borrow from the capital market, they have to get a law passed by the National State Assembly. They have to get approval of the Ministry of Finance, Federal Ministry of Finance. They have to get SEC approval. And the requirement is that the projects with the funds will be used are specified and they are ring-fenced. Ring-fenced to the extent that you're not allowed to apply the price of that bond offer to any other project other than what that was specified in the prospectus. Unfortunately, at the national level, the federal government borrows with several tools that are not bound to impose some implementation or execution limitations on them. The federal government goes on a weekly basis to borrow either through the primary market in the treasury-based window or the open market operation, the secondary market, and that their borrowing is not specified the purpose for which it will be used. Beyond that, the government issues bonds. The federal government issues federal government bonds on a monthly basis. And those bonds, the government does not specify the purpose of the bonds. So you realize that the borrowings are going to basically recurrent overhead expenditure of the government. Even the foreign currency borrowing, most of them are not targeted at specific projects. The ideal thing is that before the government should borrow, they should go to the National Assembly. And if we don't have that law, we should go and make that law. So it becomes compelling for government to abide by the utilization purpose for which of the borrowings. If we don't have that, then the government will continue to borrow and spend on recurrent expenditure. That's why we're seeing ballooning of recurrent expenditure and ballooning of our debt, but without any tangible improvement in infrastructure. Classical example, the government has so far borrowed about 12 trillion naira in the past 3.5 years. Total capital expenditure from the beginning for the past 3 years is less than 5 trillion. So in effect, more than 7 trillion have been spent on the current expenditure. And the problem with spending borrowing on the current expenditure is that you are not building the infrastructure that will improve productive activities so that the government earnings can grow and meet the future repayment obligations. So when you borrow and consume it, you have created a debt trap because there is no incremental productive capacity that will generate revenue to pay back that debt.
But Mr. Muda, some people would say that taking all of these foreign loans to execute capital projects such as rail, road, airports and water dams, well, we should be looking towards the area of having these means of transportation fuel our local markets. But we don't have that diversification yet, and you've made mention of that. At the end of the day, the everyday Nigerian man just wants to see that he has food on his table. So if we are having these projects go for the medium or long term, then how do we then incorporate the diversification to ensure that we have these dividends reach our hands?
First of all, the borrowing thing, if you look at the Fiscal Responsibility Act, it specifies the purposes for which the country can borrow. And it specifies the kind of terms for borrowing. First, the loans have to be at concessionary rate. When they say concessionary, it has to be something that is very low, not just single digit, but almost 2%, 1%, that kind of thing. And it must be borrowing that is tied to projects. That is what the Fiscal Responsibility Act stipulates. Unfortunately, many of the provisions of that act are not adhered to. So we find situations where government is borrowing at 14%, at 15%, which is very high. So that is one issue. The second point is that some of these borrowings are also used not for capital expenditure. They are not used to build the capacity of the economy to repay. They are used sometimes just for recurrent expenditure. So if you must continue to canvass for borrowing, because we need to borrow, we can't run away from it. Because the government hasn't got the resources. But the borrowing must be such that are tied to projects, particularly infrastructure. Because the productivity problems we have in this economy is largely as a result of the huge deficit in infrastructure.
But we
don't have the resources to fill that gap. So if you borrow to deal with that, it is not a bad idea. And that is where some of these bilateral loans are better than just going to the bond market to borrow. The damage that the poor transportation system is causing this economy today is enormous. Even the smallholder farmers that you see, some of these post-harvest losses and all of that, some of this productivity problem in the agricultural sector, some of these challenges with food inflation has a great deal to do with the absence of the railway system.
You know, you can say, oh, well, we have enough proceeds. The problem now is transportation. Agriculture in itself has not been grown, you know, to a large extent enough. People are still struggling with farm produce, their fertilizers, you know, it's getting into the wrong hands. People are having problems with insecurity. The likes of, in River State, you know, Gone, in Eche, where they do a lot of Gary production, most of the people who are cassava farmers can't go to their farms because of insecurity.
You see, let me make this point. Transportation infrastructure is very critical to building the capacity of this economy. It's very critical. Because you have a country as vast as we have. And you have to move product from one point to the other. You have to move it on road. Have you traveled the length and breadth of this country to see the condition of these roads? It's not just about agriculture. This economy is about a lot of things. It's about interaction between what a manufacturer produces in Lagos. How do you get it to Maiduguri? How do you get it to Aba, where the market is?